Lewis Wall.
Mr Speaker, ngā mihi o te whare. It's my pleasure to speak on this, the Human Rights Amendment Bill, in this its second reading. Labor opposes this bill, and we oppose the bill for two distinct reasons. The first reason is that the Human Rights Commission should not have to consult with the Minister about their priorities. Currently, the Human Rights Commission is an independent Crown entity. They're an independent Crown entity with organisations such as the Electoral Commission, the Health and Disability Commissioner, the Law Commission, the Independent Police Conduct Authority, the Privacy Commissioner. Why are they independent? Because sometimes their investigations actually mean they have a responsibility to hold the government accountable. That's the reason that those entities exist in our society, to hold the government accountable. Having to report to the Minister would make them a Crown agent or an autonomous Crown entity. And what do those entities have to do within our public system? They either have to give effect or have regard to government policy. And that's the fundamental problem we have with that part of this piece of legislation. The second reason why Labor is opposing this legislation is because it disestablishes the Race Relations Commissioner and the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner. Now, I'd like to take us on a bit of a historical journey because when we look at how those positions were created within our society, actually they all go back to the United Nations. So the United Nations was formed on the 24th of October 1945, and as an international body, what the United Nations actually has done since their creation was develop conventions. So the first such convention that's relevant to the piece of legislation before the House today is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. That was adopted by the United Nations on the 21st of December 1965. New Zealand signed that convention on the 25th of October 1966. And to ratify that as a country, what did we do? We established the Race Relations Office, actually, and from the Race Relations Office, we created the Race Relations Commissioner. So that particular office then held us as a country accountable to the fact that we ratified this international UN document. The second instrument that's relevant to this conversation that we're having this afternoon is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That was adopted by the United Nations on the 16th of December 1966. New Zealand signed that covenant on the 12th of November 1968. And how did we, embody within our society our commitment to that particular covenant? Actually, we created the Human Rights Act in 1977. So the Human Rights Commission was created, the Human Rights Commissioner was created because it displayed internationally our commitment to these UN conventions or covenants. In 2001, however, we did merge those two, so elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, civil and political rights, where we brought the Race Relations Commission and the Human Rights Commission together. The next convention that's relevant to our discussions here in the House is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So that was adopted by the United Nations on the 18th of December 1979. New Zealand signed that on the 10th of January 1985, but in fact in 1984 we'd already established the Ministry of Women's Affairs. And actually I'd like to take this opportunity to say happy 30th anniversary to the Ministry for Women. I know that there's an event tonight and tomorrow, and it's to signify our commitment to that international convention and New Zealand's commitment to ensuring that the rights of women actually had a very specific vehicle within our public service to give effect, obviously, to our commitment to the equality between men and women. In 1993, when the Human Rights Amendment Act was enacted, we actually created the Equal Opportunities Commissioner. So that's how that position, again, displayed our commitment to that particular convention. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it was adopted by the United Nations on the 13th of December 2006. We signed that convention on the 30th of March 2007, and we ratified that on the 26th of September. And I guess if there is one small area within the bill that we can acknowledge, is that what this bill creates is a priority focus on disability rights. And so a particular commissioner will have, I guess, the mandate for representing the rights of our community who have disability as a part of their identity and their life here in our country. And I'd just like to highlight that 22 of the 42 submitters actually supported that focus. So what this bill essentially is going to do is have a chief commissioner, 4 to 5 other commissioners, and then focus areas will be disability, EEO and race relations. And I guess if that's the rationale or logic for those particular focus areas, I actually want the Minister and this House to consider the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was adopted by the United Nations on the 13th of September 2007. This government actually announced support for that on the 20th of April 2010. And I guess I have to stand here as a member of the Labour Party who was the government when this particular UN declaration was adopted and acknowledge that at that point in time we didn't support that particular declaration. Neither did Australia, neither did Canada, neither did the United States. But I'm pleased to say now that the 4 countries I've just mentioned actually do now support this particular declaration. So I guess, and I probably should say why we didn't, because it was all about Article 26 of that declaration, and I'll read it. It says, Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories and resources they've traditionally owned, occupied or otherwise used or acquired. And it's appropriate that the Minister of Treaty Negotiations is here in the House, because I think we obviously...
I am going to interrupt the member and ask her to come back to something closer to the bill.
The reason I'm highlighting this is because, based on the logic of the government, there should be actually an Indigenous Rights Commissioner. Based on the logic of this bill and the areas that they've identified, there should be an Indigenous Rights Commissioner. So I guess my question, and maybe in the committee stages I'll have an opportunity to ask the Minister, but the focus really for me is about the specificity of the commissioners that we have and the relevance to international human rights conventions that New Zealand has signed up to since 1966, and whether or not that logic should be applied as we go into the future. And obviously, from my perspective, if we were going to future-proof this piece of legislation, we would also look at the rights of LGBTI people, because it seems within the international human rights framework that LGBTI peoples are one of the most marginalised and victimised people. Kia ora.
This debate is interrupted and set down for resumption next sitting day. The House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. on Tuesday the 31st of March 2015.